Some questions that occupy the author's thoughts when you're writing. You know, writing for academic journals is highly competitive. Okay. As I said to you, our journal, the International Journal of Construction Education and Research, we reject 80% of the papers. That's extremely high. So to get your paper published, you actually need to be doing what it is the actual journal requires you to do. Okay. Sometimes even you get a positive feedback from the reviewers. Okay. But then actually the reviewers actually give you some feedback and you reorientate your paper. But then what about the readers? What about the people out in the community? And remember, academic journals are looking to publish research. So what is the novelty about your research? What is it that actually helps the actual community out there to understand what it is you're coming up with and what it is you're finding? Okay. The subjectivity around that I've kind of touched on. There's no simple formulas other than an amount of hard work. And again, I'll touch on that when I actually bring you to show you the International Journal of Construction Education website and some of the things you might want to reflect on. And again, how do you deal with rejection? Do you actually dismiss it? Do you just plod on? Do you forget about that journal? Or do you go back to that journal? I had a situation with one of my students in the past, first year student with me, very prolific researcher, was doing extremely well, had the literature review of the subject area done very, very early on, submitted an abstract to ARCOM, the Association of Researchers in Construction Management Conference, and was rejected. And looking back with 2020 vision and hindsight, that was where the wheels came off her journey for herself. Now she's back on track, but it took her a long time to get over rejection. So a lot of work had to be done with her and to bring her around that, to understand that it wasn't her per se, it was actually the piece of work. But it does, rejection can actually set you back in your process. So it's important to have that mentor beside you and with you that actually able to help you actually navigate that rejection. So challenges, how do you respond to reviewer feedback? Okay, so if, for example, a reviewer makes a comment in relation to something and you don't believe it and you don't want to actually address it, so you have to actually think about that in terms of what will happen. And I mentioned power earlier on, so you have to think about, how might the reviewers take you actually not accepting their comments. And again, that can cause some angst for researchers and authors, because actually it goes against, you may have to kind of, pacify the reviewer to some extent while actually standing up for the work that you've done. So that can be a tricky situation to actually navigate. And actually, what do you do in some cases where the actual two reviewers differ in their viewpoint? That to me is probably a better situation than both reviewers being negative towards your work. If you're in a position where the two reviewers have differing sided comments, well, then you're able to actually defend your position more. But again, if reviewers are raising a question, they're raising a question because they don't fully understand the message that you're trying to tell them. And again, in your feedback and in your reflection on addressing the comments, you need to think about that. How can I tell my message more clearly? Because sometimes it's the case that people are not quite understanding what it is you're writing about. Structure on a paper is really, really important. So what I would say to people in terms of preparation for that is, if you're writing for a particular journal, go to the journal and look at previous papers, look at what the approach to methodology is, look at the approach to the introduction to the paper, look at how conclusions and recommendations and analysis are handled. And that will give you an idea of acceptable structures for that particular journal. Because again, journals are made up of different academics, they often the case actually have a structure around what it is they expect people to be writing. And they're expecting you to know that. So the best way to find that out is to actually engage with the actual journal's previous editions and previous volumes. And then the question that often occupies your mind, and again, I've mentioned a few cases from myself where, you know, will I revise this paper and put it back in? It could be another 6 months before you get the completion of that. Will you stick with it? Or is it a case of maybe taking it out and resubmitting it somewhere else, you know, which is quite acceptable to do also. So that's, you know, some of the questions and the elements that people think about. So the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom, they do a lot of work on educational or academic journals. So here's just a snippet of some of the editors from different journals and what they say. And this is you know, journal editors giving feedback, you know, as to what are the issues for early career writers or people who are putting in, you know. So the first one there, Hugh McLaughlin, Social Work, Education, an International Journal. You know, we get people trying to tell us the whole PhD in 6,000 words, and it just doesn't work. You know, and again, a piece of advice, and it was something I got from my supervisor when I started my PhD. I published along the journey. So what you could do is pick phases of the research, systematic literature review, phase 1 of the research, phase 2 of the research, phase 4 of the research. And then what you could do is then do a paper that pulls that together, a synopsis of your PhD, for example. So what you're getting in those instances is actually publications from the different phases of your research. You know, and you can see there information coming from an editor of a journal. People try to cram in too much. Okay. So maybe that's important. And you know, his comment there, using a specific aspect of the research as a hook. What aspect of your research would you like to focus on and deliver? You know, so if you for example did a research study and there was qualitative and quantitative research in it, well, you could deliver a paper on the qualitative research. You could deliver a paper on the quantitative research. And also then you could actually deliver a paper on the actual comparison between the two pieces of research feedback, or you know, an analysis of that. So again, you know, think about the structure about what it is you want to do. You know. Another one is that people often submit to journals not really knowing the scope of the journal. And when I say scope, is what it is that gets published in that journal. Okay, so again, Ian Russell there, Science at Oxford University Press, he is indicating that there. So someone sticks a paper into their journal, doesn't really decide that actually I'm going to go after this journal. I want to my research actually sits really well with the publishings of this journal. That is key. Make sure that you pick the correct journal in terms of its scope and its processes. Okay, some more words here. Don't overstate your methodology. Okay, so this is Fiona McAuley of the Journal of Latin American Studies. My take on this is you need to talk about your methodology. You need to have a justification of your methodology and your methodological approach. So it is an important part of the paper, but it's the justification of it. It's not reproducing the background to ethnography, for example. If you're doing an ethnographic study, it's the why did you choose to use ethnography over some other methodology? So it's a defense of your methodological approach rather than just actually putting in what ethnography is. Because at this stage, reviewers know, if you're writing in social science, for example, you would be, the reviewers know what ethnography is. But what makes your study or methodology chosen ethnographic? So justifying you did it. What were some of the challenges that you had to overcome to do that? So then what you're doing is, when you're justifying it like that, you're actually orientating your paper away from actually just stating facts, but more towards justification. And there's novelty. Why did you choose what method to use, and an understanding of that. Okay. And another element as well, Deborah Sweet talks about a story that progresses logically rather than chronologically. And I think that's really, really important. And this is quite interesting. Deborah is the editor of CellStem, or stem cell research. Okay. So again, one would think that journal is actually quite scientific, yet the editor is talking about progressing a story logically. So there needs to be a story. You need to start at A and complete it through to D or F or whatever. So that, that the actual reader understands, your introduction into your methodology, into your analysis, into your conclusions and recommendations. And that is a flowing. So there's a link between the different sections, that it's not just, an introduction that's not linked to the work, a literature review that's just dropped in, and methods that are just dropped in. So if you were going to write chronologically like that, then the reviewers are going to look at it as just a bland paper. It hasn't really a contribution. It won't sustain their interests. So it's difficult to keep the reviewer on side and give you positive feedback. So again, think about that structure. That's really, really important in terms of how you write. And again, they're just snippets I've taken in terms of things that I look at.